Is this geared to clergy or any leaders in the church? It is geared to those who are the primary leaders. So this, when we talk about the leadership project right now, it's not geared to, say, the board of a church, but it is geared to the primary leadership of the church. But I want to say to you that that doesn't mean it has to be a clergy or an ordained person, because there are now all kinds of ways in which congregations are being led by people who have not gone through those formal ordination tracks. So it's welcome to those kind of people. It says, has this been a result of COVID, or has COVID just uncovered it? I'm trying to keep up was the church always a creaky ship before COVID? Well, I think that, I don't think COVID caused this. I think COVID sped it up and uncovered it. I think prior to COVID, we could live in lots of denial. I wouldn't say the church has been a creaky ship. I would say that from the Second World War on, most churches and most denominations were very successful, were very effective, did really well. But then sometime in the latter part of the last millennium, it all began to come undone. And we've lived in about 20 years of utter denial of this undoing. And part of what COVID has done is simply sped it up. I'm just trying to keep up with with those in judicatories find this helpful. I think that judicatory leaders are in a particularly tough place right now. And in the leadership project, if there are numbers, we would love to put together a small cohort of those who are judicatory leaders to look at their role. One says, if the main role of a leader is to point, name, and celebrate, how does this role have some authority tied to it? Or is it also one of the shifts we're thinking of making? Well, I think it's a great question because in the ways in which, to a large extent, not completely, in the ways in which we function to this point, and particularly in the training, in what I call the clergy industry, in the books that we've just written, authority gets resided in ordination and certain kinds of roles and the language that we use. And I think to a large extent, that positional authority cannot be the main vehicle, the main form of leadership moving forward. And so it is a shift. And that's part of the shift that we've got to learn, not just as leaders, but as congregations. And it's the kind of thing we want to look at very closely and talk about in the months ahead. And somebody, Nathan, wants to know, can you re-articulate the hope-filled, encouraging message? Well, in a few words, yeah, I can. The message that we keep getting is not hope-filled. The message we keep getting is things are going to hell in a handbasket, that the wheels are coming off the structures and organizations. And I agree with that message, but it's not the primary message that we have as God's people. The primary message, and this is what we've wrote about in our books, the primary message is one that's been fundamentally lost, which is that our hope and our future is not dependent upon our skills, our abilities, our tactics, our programs, our resources. It's built on the fact that God is active and God is the agent ahead of us, and that's not changed. The biblical promise from the very beginning that's picked up again in Ephesians, that what God is doing in Jesus is the remaking of all things. And that remaking is not off in the future. It's right now where we live. That's what the hope is all about. And that's where, for me, the energy is found. Sue says, I'm thinking specifically at board meetings. Where might one start to invite more spirit fully into the daily work of board meetings? The quick answer to that, Sue, is that on our website, there are lots of resources. And one of those would be Leading Out of COVID, which is a very simple, brief resource for how, as a board, you begin to get into conversations. There are other resources there on how, as a pastor, you can help your board very quickly, very briefly, begin to ask the question, how are we going about making decisions? What does that look like? And how do we talk about it? So those are some ways of getting at that. So I think, Andrew, so are you saying connecting with God's shalom is the same as the Missio Dei? Well, what I'm saying, without getting into long conversations, is that in Isaiah, for example, the language of shalom is the language of God's kingdom, of God's coming. It's shorthand for this is what God is doing. This is what God's kingdom. And so that language is picked up in the New Testament in different ways. So yes, it is part of the Missio Dei. Could you comment on how rule of life pieces fall into these themes? Part of rule of life, and different groups have different rules of life. So for example, my friend Roy Searle, who's one of the founders of the Northumbria community, their rule of life is availability and vulnerability. And so if you take that as a rule of life and you take it in everything I've just said, identity, community, decision-making, then those activities come out of the practice of how can I/we be increasingly available and vulnerable to the people of our neighbors and communities. So in many ways, rule of life very much is shaped by what we're discovering and what we're saying. So Doug, I hope that responds to what you're asking. Al Fletcher.